everyone, my name is Emily and welcome to my February wrap-up. So February was a massive improvement on January in terms of reading. I caught up a lot on my reading goal and I also managed to participate in Tome Topple readathon. So I read a lot of big books this month. In total, I managed to read 9 books and most of a 10th one. Admittedly, a lot of them were shorter books, but I enjoyed them and I don't think there's really shame in reading shorter books. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about some books. The first book I completed in February was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This is of course the classic novel about 4 sisters living in the northeastern United States during the Civil War. We get to see them growing up and dealing with different obstacles that come their way as women who live in this era. So I'd read this book before when I was a lot younger, but I hadn't read it in a while and I didn't remember it very well. This reread was also prompted by the release of the newest film adaptation last December. If you've been subscribed for a while, you know that I have been pretty openly critical of this film, but in preparation for making that video, I read this book again. I was really surprised on this reread by how much I related to this novel. I think I relate to it a lot more than I used to, and maybe that's just because I'm older now. This is a story about growing up from girls into women, and I just got it. So the story is about these 4 sisters, Meg, Jo, Amy, and Beth. But the moral center of the story is Marmee, and she is often in a position where she has to give them a lot of advice, but then also sometimes she sits back and lets them learn their lessons by experience. And a lot of the lessons that she was trying to impart on them at the time felt so preachy to me when I first read it. But now I looked back and I read it and I was like, wow, I totally get it. Marmee was right the whole time. And a lot of these girls' arcs, how they ended up, it all just really made sense to me. A lot of times it felt so stodgy and old-fashioned to me at the time, but now I'm just like, wow, this is the reality of adulthood playing out, and I get it. And this time round, I was reminded a lot of themes that are really crucial to the book, but that the newest film adaptation left out. It's a very Christian novel and very transcendentalist. This book is very focused on taking on the burdens of life and improving yourself. And to me, the film did not adequately address this theme, and along with other things, but we're not talking about that film right now. So anyway, I gave this book 5 stars upon my most recent reread. I enjoyed it immensely. It's a very warm but very grounded story, and I'm just really glad that I reread it. Next up is Winterwood by Shay Earnshaw. So this book is about a girl called Nora, and she comes from a family of witches. They live in this small town by a lake, and that lake is near a haunted magical forest. That forest is very dangerous, and even Nora's family can't really go in unless it's the right time. So when the novel takes place, the area is completely snowed in and people can't really go away very easily. And nearby Nora's house is a boys' camp where one of the boys has gone missing. He is presumed dead because it is incredibly snowy and cold, but Nora finds him one night in this forest, which raises a lot of questions. There's a whole mystery around why he isn't dead and what he might have been doing before he went missing. So I gave this 3.5 stars on Goodreads. I really loved the atmosphere of this book and the writing. I love the small interludes in this book where we get to know a different member of this family. They're each excerpts from the family book, or I think it's really their grimoire. Of course, I'm a sucker for any book with witchy vibes. And the mystery was engaging too. I was really interested in what was going on. Of course, this book dragged a lot in places. Also, the romance in this book is super insta-love. I'm not super against insta-love, but sometimes it can give me pause about the validity of a love story and its development. Also, we get a part in the end, which I won't really talk about in detail because of spoilers, but we kind of get to know what Nora's magic is, and I feel like it created some plot holes in the story, or maybe wasn't dealt with very well. But yeah, I would have liked to see the magic be a bit more grounded in this universe, or have people actually putting together spell components to actually do things. So this was a fine book overall. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exactly the best thing I had read. Definitely not my most memorable read of the month. The next book I read was Odd and the Frost Giants by Neil Gaiman. This is basically a children's story with Norse mythology worked in. This is about a boy called Odd who lives in a village of Norsemen. He is crippled because of a tree cutting accident. He hasn't gotten along with his family very well, so he goes out on his own in the woods and decides to make a living for himself. And in doing so, he has a divine encounter of sorts. And that kind of includes getting involved with the problems of the gods. So I found this very charming, short, and sweet. I always love seeing Norse mythology being worked into stories, and this was a really nice one. Next up, I read the Metabarons Volume 5, Steelhead by Alejandro Jodorowsky. If you haven't heard me talk about the Metabarons enough, the Metabarons is a comic book series about a family of space mercenaries. It's a family with a very brutal culture. Each generation, the son has to kill his father in mortal combat in order to inherit the legacy of the family. So this volume was very weird and cool, just like any other Jodorowsky book. This story surrounds Steelhead, who, for reasons in the previous book, has a robotic head and he doesn't have normal human emotions. But the thing is, he really wants to be a real boy. So this story sees him setting out to do that. And the way it plays out is great and fun to watch. I gave this 4 stars on Goodreads. I'm still really enjoying this series and looking forward to getting to the future volumes. The next book I read is another Neil Gaiman book. It was Snow Glass Apples. This is a retelling of Snow White from the Wicked Queen's perspective. And this perspective may or may not involve vampires. I really enjoyed this book. The artwork was beautiful but disturbing at times, and so was the story, but this is pretty par for the course with Neil Gaiman. There's not much to say about this, but if you like fairy tale retellings with a touch of horror and you're looking for something short, this is where it's at. So, Tome Topple Readathon happened. The first book I finished during Tome Topple was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I had already been reading this book since December, but I got the audiobook and that really sped me up in terms of reading. So I finished this during, say, the first 3 or 4 days of Tome Topple. I just don't really know where to begin with this book. Like, it took me a long time to read, but it was still so good. So basically this book is about an alternative Regency England with wizards, and we get to see 2 very prominent magicians arise above others and how they affect the politics of that period. And there's a whole incident dealing with a power-hungry fairy. So of course this book was beautifully written, and I really love parlor politics and gossip and schemes and that sort of thing. But I also identified very strongly with the deeper themes of the story. So I've participated in academia, so I've been privy to some pretty epic academic spats. I witnessed a couple conflicts between respected figures in my field. So I can really identify with this story of how ego can hamper intelligent individuals and keep them from seeing the bigger picture. There's some really amazing commentary on intellectual elitism and how class plays into that. There's also some really great portrayals of British and military bureaucracy that made for some really humorous moments. And I also love, while the magic in this world is kind of a soft system, it doesn't conveniently solve all of the problems in this world. If anything, a lot of times it creates more problems. And I loved a lot of the characters. Childermass is probably my favorite, closely followed by Jonathan Strange and Stephen. But Childermass is a really unappreciated badass. I love him. So I gave this book 5 stars on Goodreads. I really enjoyed this, and I think it's already one of the favorite books that I've read this year. The next book I read was The God's Own County, a heathen prayer book by Dan Coltis and the Heathens of Yorkshire. So if you don't know, heathenry is the religion that focuses on worship of the Germanic and Norse gods. The name heathen was appropriated during the rise of Christianity to refer to individuals who didn't worship the mainstream religions like Islam and Christianity. This faith is something that I've been engaging a lot with, and I just wanted something that would introduce me to heathen prayer and help me with formatting prayers. And this was a really good book for that. So this book has a few prayers for each Norse god. Something I would have liked would have been a blurb for each god before we dove into each prayer, because then we would know, well, what do we go to this god for, or this god, and what's the background of this god, and why are they good for this? But other than that, I found this read really helpful, and it was also really helpful for rituals as well. So I gave this 4 stars on Goodreads. So the next book I read was also during Tome Topple Readathon, and that was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So after I finished Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I started The Way of Kings, and I accepted that this book was going to take the rest of Tome Topple. It's over 1,000 pages long. It's basically the length of 2 books. But this was one of the top books I wanted to read this year, and I especially wanted to get around to it this Tome Topple. So this book is on its face pretty Wheel of Time inspired. This book takes place in a world that was once protected by a group of knights called the Knights Radiant. But thousands and thousands of years ago, they abandoned their duty, and now the world has to contend with a lot of political and magical turmoil. So we follow multiple perspectives in this book of people who are navigating this world. Szeth is something called a surge finder, and he wields a shard blade, which was one of the main weapons of the Knights Radiant. Dalinar is a knight who also wields a shard blade, and he is trying to protect the king of his country after the previous king's assassination. Shallan is trying to be the ward to this princess in order to help her family out. Kaladin is a former soldier who has been sold into slavery because his former liege lord sold him in order to cover up his own crime. There's a lot of good things that can be said about this book. It addresses a lot of themes of slavery and racial elitism. The world is very well developed and intricate, and I really get that this is a living and breathing universe. There's also some pretty good character work for all the POV characters. I think Shallan and Dalinar are my favorites. I will say that the magic system is a bit harder than I'm used to. I usually read softer systems, but once I got used to how this world works, I actually got it. It was fine. Sometimes Brandon Sanderson's action scenes feel a lot like video game playthroughs. We're really concerned with how the balances of different protective items and offensive items balance out. We also get a lot of names of different tactical moves. His dialogue work is still a bit stilted, but this is also a massive improvement on the first Mistborn novel. So I gave this 4 stars on Goodreads, maybe even 4.5. I really did enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to the next book. The last book I read in February was Morning Star by Pierce Brown. This was the 3rd volume in the Red Rising trilogy. This takes place in a futuristic universe where humankind has spread to different planets, but society is divided into different color-coded castes. And the gold caste is at the top of this hierarchy. The main character of this story is Darrow. He is born a red, which is the lowest color, but then he is recruited by a incendiary group called the Sons of Ares, and his task is to impersonate a gold and to rise in the ranks and incite a revolution. But the first book in the series wasn't the most original book. It was basically Hunger Games in space. But the second and third books really upped their game. There was a lot of political machinations, and we really got to see a lot more of the world and how it works. This book was probably my favorite. There were a lot of twists and turns. I'm still not sure I connect very deeply with each of the characters, but I still liked them. I was still rooting for them. So I gave this book 4 stars on Goodreads. It was great. So that's it for my February wrap-up. Thank you very much for watching. If you like my content, please subscribe and like this video. Let me know down below which books you read in February. In the meantime, you can also follow me on Twitter and Goodreads and Instagram, and I will see you in my next video.